Who actually won the World War II? Because it seems like in many countries, history has been rewritten. Even a quick Google search will show you. Polling data over the decades shows a strong home team bias, citizens primarily crediting their own nation. In 1945, many Europeans credited the USSR, but over time, memory has shifted towards the US and Western nations. Today, Americans, French, and Germans largely credit the US, while Russians almost exclusively credit the USSR. According to a French poll conducted by a French Institute of Public Opinions over the years, in May 1945, 57% of the French credited the Soviet Union with the greatest contribution, with only 20% citing the US. By 2015, this reversed to 54% crediting the US and only 23% the USSR. Let's have a look at the real numbers. Here are the human losses during the World War II. As you can see, Soviet Union suffered the biggest amount of losses, over 25 million people. Now let's refer to a Canada's military history magazine and who they think contributed the most to the defeat of Hitler's forces. Hugh Halliday, author of a dozen books, says approximately 70% of all German troops killed fell on the Eastern Front. It goes without saying that the Soviet Union played the largest role in determining victory. John Bellew, an army veteran, says the USSR made the greatest contribution to the Allied victory in Europe. Wars are won by physical means and morale. On the physical side, men, material, and money, the Soviets contributed about 62% of Allied soldiers, 57.5% of all artillery, 45% of tanks, 25% of aircraft, and 34% of military expenditures. All Soviet resources were directed against Germany. American and British ones were used against other enemies in other theaters. On the morale side, unlike Britain and the US, the Soviets had parts of their homeland occupied by Germany, given added impetus to defeat the invader. I'm sure you'll ask, but what about the Lend-Lease provided by the US and Britain to the USSR? Let's have a look at the extracts from a book named The West Point Military History of the Second World War from the 1980s. Although nearly half the population and the great industrial region of the Donetsk remained under German occupation, the Soviets still found men for new armies and vastly increased war production. They defeated the Germans at Stalingrad almost entirely through their own efforts and would probably have won the same victory if they had received no assistance at all. Although Lend-Lease was a great help from 1943 to the end of the war, the Soviets had no cause to feel unduly grateful. It had not arrived during their greatest peril, but only when they began to win the war anyway. Even when the goods were available in America, much time was lost in transport. There were just 3 practical routes, all of them difficult, across the Pacific to Vladivostok and through Siberia by rail. An extract from another book by David Glantz, When Titans Clashed. If the Western Allies had not provided equipment and invaded Northwest Europe, Stalin and his commanders might have taken 12 to 18 months longer to finish off the Wehrmacht. The result would probably have been the same, except that Soviet soldiers would have waited at France's Atlantic beaches rather than meeting the Allies at the Elbe. And this is by no means to undermine the importance of the Lend-Lease from the Allies to the Soviet Union. It's just to show that it was not primarily the military equipment supply which helped, it was other things which were less obvious, such as trucks for transportation, or even buttons for clothes, or things like food as well. So that helped a lot to unburden the Soviet economy during the war. But if you actually do your research, you will find that the Lend-Lease contributed to no more than 10% of the total Soviet war effort. The reality was a bit more complicated and perhaps inconclusive. Most likely the Soviets would have won regardless, as the Eastern Front for the Germans was unwinnable after the Battle of Stalingrad, before most of the aid to the USSR arrived. But Lend-Lease also certainly helped shorten the war and saved lives. Now, let's have a look what percentage of the Hitler's forces were already destroyed before the D-Day. Historians largely agree that by D-Day, The vast majority, roughly 75 to 80% of the German army's total personnel losses that had occurred in the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union. And finally, let's not forget that it was the Soviet Union who raised the red flag over the Reichstag, after which Germany was split into two parts, Eastern and Western. And once again, this is by no means to undermine the war effort of other allies. These are just some important historical facts which seem to be forgotten by many these days.